Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on building organisational resilience, things for small charities to consider. It's great to have so many of you on the call today. So to mark Policy Day of Small Charity Week, we are hosting this webinar in association with Charities Aid Foundation. So my name is Josie, I'm Capacity Building Programmes Manager here at NCVO. Lex, can you move on to the next slide, please? And I'm delighted to be joined today by Beth Clarke, Programme Manager at CAF, and three of my colleagues here at NCVO, Elizabeth Chamberlain, Head of Policy, Alex Sparrow, Lead Consultant in our Charities Evaluation team, and Dan Francis, Lead Governance Consultant. So as many of you will already know, Small Charity Week is focused on celebrating and raising awareness of the essential work of small charities and the contributions of millions. The coronavirus pandemic has been the ultimate test of resilience for all charities, but for smaller ones in particular. The pandemic has also highlighted just how much small charities are needed, particularly in times of crises. Alex, can you move on again? Thank you. So the term resilience is often mentioned, but what does it mean? And what does it mean for small charities in this new normal? And finally, what do leaders of small charities need to think about as they try to make their organisations resilient to the real challenges that lie ahead? To help try and shed some light on the answers to these questions, in this webinar, we're going to start by hearing from Beth, who's going to help us understand the term resilience and what CAF's research has shown to be the characteristics of a resilient charity. And then we're going to hand over to my NCVO colleagues, who are going to speak about 5 of the characteristics of resilience, highlighting key things for small charities to consider and signposting you to some useful practical tools and resources. We will have about 15 minutes at the end for questions, so do feel free to submit your questions as we move through the presentation. And a final reminder, we are going to be recording this webinar, and the recording is going to be sent to you afterwards. The recording is also available on NCVO Know-How in our coronavirus section. You should have already received the slides, and apologies now if you received the wrong set of slides initially. We have now sent you the correct version. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Beth.
Thank you, Josie. So I work at CAF at Charities Aid Foundation, and I've been running a programme working with 10 smaller charities around developing their resilience for the last couple of years. It is very difficult to measure resilience. I will start by saying that. When I came into role, one of the biggest challenges that I had right at the beginning was looking at how will we actually define resilience and how will we measure that. So as we move on to the next slide, I think the only way really to know when a charity is resilient, in all honesty, is in the future when they are put to the test. I don't know that many of us would have thought a global health pandemic was going to be that test, but certainly the reimagining of services, how they're delivered, dealing with increasing demand from those that you seek to serve, and obviously facing the very acute pressures on funding has really been quite a perfect storm for most organisations' resilience at this point in time. And to me, it really underlines the situation that we saw at CAF several years ago when we launched the programme, that many smaller charities in the UK might do great work, but often have a really pressing need for some financial investment and for some management support to help them to be resilient, able to react, flex and pivot under stress. And the extent of the demand for the programme at the time, at that point, already suggested to us that there were a number of charities who were struggling and were looking for this kind of help. So resilience is obviously on everyone's mind. I'm going to be sharing some of the learning from the programme. There may be a few of you who might have come across me yesterday on some of the Small Charity Week webinars. I'm actually going to be looking at a slightly different element of the learning from the programme, so don't worry, there should be something new for you if so. So CAF Resilience as a programme, our theory of change was that the way that we would be able to help organisations to explore their resilience, work out what resilience meant for them, and then achieve that was through giving them some time, some space, some help so that they could do it. And it was funded quite unusually by philanthropists, by individuals who give significant amounts of money to charity, as a bit of a learning one-off programme to be able to look at how a combination of advisory support, grants and a direct relationship manager would help them to be able to actually figure out where are the things where we need to be more resilient, what are our risks, what support do we need, and how can we move on from where we are now and be able to change things. So as we move to the next slide, the objectives of this particular programme were, I guess, three things. First, and really tangibly, to enable those 10 charities to be more resilient, which in and of itself is a great thing. But secondly, far more wider, to learn and share with the sector how small charities can be supported to be more resilient. What makes that difference? What changes things? What are the things that don't really change anything? What are the keys to being able to, as a funder, support those charities? And as a charity, where are the things where you should be focusing? And then thirdly, to encourage more individuals, so particularly individual philanthropists, but also other funders, to think about funding charities to be more resilient, not purely just for their programme costs. So the programme is coming to a close in the next couple of months, and there's a full report that's being written, which we look to release in the autumn, which will talk more about the impact that was made. But just today, I thought it'd be really useful to share some of the initial insights around resilience, and the team from NCVO will dive into that in some more detail. So if we move on to the next slide, we identified 6 characteristics of resilient charities at the start of the programme. There are lots and lots of individual measures that we came up with, but essentially we felt they fit into these 6 areas, which might be quite helpful for you in your own organisation to spend some time reflecting on. So this is a really simple framework for thinking about organisational resilience, and I'm just going to very briefly touch on each. So the first one was purpose, which sounds very obvious. We're all mission-directed organisations, aren't we? We have a purpose, we have a vision, we have a mission, but having this very, very clear, having the clarity and the ability to communicate it both amongst yourselves as an organisation, between the staff, the board, the volunteers, and then being able to express that externally was one of the absolute keys. It allows you as an organisation to not follow the funding or allow external bodies to dictate your organisational direction, but helps you to really stay on track and evaluate all of the opportunities that come to you against this. The second one was effective leadership. And this for us really spoke both to inside the organisation, so the staff, the volunteers, those that carry out the work, but also the trustees. I found that it's really not uncommon for charities that have grown organically from something very small to something a little bit bigger to find that they actually don't really have a fully functioning senior management team. Your charity might be at the stage where you don't have any full-time paid staff, or you're progressing towards that. You might be at the stage where you have a CEO or CEO manager type role, or perhaps you have multiple staff. But what we often found was that as an organisation grows, very often the delivery side and the people doing the delivery of the day-to-day work grows far faster than what you might call the back office, those who are keeping the organisation on track, moving it forward and focused on strategy. So at a certain point in a charity's growth, we noticed that very often the organisations would run the risk of moving into a bit of a cycle of constant troubleshooting and really bunkering down rather than developing and moving forward and thinking about where they wanted to go. That's really natural when you have a lack of sort of hands to be able to get on with these things, but the charity can't really be very effectively led when that's happening. So one of the things that this programme looked at is the effective leadership between both those that are employed or volunteer for the charity and the trustee board themselves, and how those two work together. I think the board can play a really important role by supporting the chief exec or person who's leading most of the work, whoever that might be, to develop a team around them that share the responsibility, so it's not all just sat with one person. Moving on to being well networked, so networks and partnerships. Being able to get support from and work in partnership with other organisations was absolutely one of the characteristics of resilient charities that we saw. There's a tendency very often, I think, to only network with and only partner with organisations that work within your own cause area. So if you're a young people's charity, to only work with other young people's charities or medical, etc. One of the things that we've seen through the programme that we've been doing for the last couple of years, supporting a cohort of 10 charities, is that there can be some real benefits of networking with those who are outside of your own causal area, to be able to actually work with those who are maybe doing something different but complementary, and also to understand how they work differently and get some of their own ideas. I'd really encourage you as an organisation to have a think about who there is that maybe isn't in your locality or isn't within your causal area that you might be able to learn from. When you're not competing for funding with them, when you work in quite different spaces, it often allows for really strong honesty and peer support. So perhaps think about who else you might be missing. Moving on to the next one with my little overview. So each of these will get broken down in more detail soon. Financial and operational fitness. I fully recognise this is a huge topic. There are a large number of things that sit underneath this. Of the many things I could say on this, I guess one that I would highlight from the programme is how crucial it is to make sure that your trustee board really understand your current income mix. We work with a number of charities that say we'd really like to diversify our income, we'd like to start getting money from other sources, perhaps they've only been getting money from grants up until now and they'd like to expand that and get money from elsewhere, which is a really great ambition to have. What we do often find though is that the trustee board will have an overview of where the funding comes from, but often aren't as clear on the detail. Whereas those who work at the staff, a manager or a finance person or whoever that might be, are generally far clearer on both how many types of funding you have for starters. So is that grants, is that contracts, is that individuals that give you money? And also within each of those, how diverse they are. So for example, if you're a charity that gets half of its income from major donors, that sounds okay. But if that actually just represents 2 individuals who are giving you half of your income, that's really quite a risk. So I would just really encourage you to have a think about checking in with your board to make sure that they really understand the income mix before making decisions around financial diversification. As I say, there are many things I could say on that. That just seemed like one that comes up frequently with the charities that we work with. Moving on to impact. Obviously, being able to identify and to communicate the needs that you meet as an organisation and the impact that you have is crucial. And many organisations just get better and better at understanding how to capture the value of their work and speak about it. Something we found on the programme, though, that I thought was really interesting was how many organisations, how many charities we worked with were pretty good at reporting back to their funders and demonstrating the impact of their work to them. But it was surprising how many charities actually didn't really capture their impact for themselves. So they weren't using that information internally, either to report against their own objectives and outcomes and to drive their performance forward so that they could be sure that they were better meeting beneficiaries' needs, or using it as a way of celebrating the milestones they'd hit and the progress they'd made. So something maybe to reflect on is whether or not as a charity you focus your impact reporting on communicating that to people externally and the things that they want to know about, as opposed to using that for yourselves to really use that as a way of keeping yourselves close to your mission and to your purpose. The 6th area of resilient charities that we had was awareness. I think in the current context, there are very few charities that aren't, this isn't high on their list at the moment, of thinking about the political, economic, local, national context that you work in, and kind of horizon scanning for challenges, threats and opportunities. The local voluntary sector landscape has changed significantly over the last however many years. So one of the things that we found really was a characteristic of charities that were able to pivot was those that had been paying attention to what was going on in the outside world, what the ecosystem around them looked like, and were making sure that they used that as a way of reflecting on how they were doing. So as I mentioned in the autumn, we'll be reporting on the programme and the difference it's made. But as I move on to the next slide, I just wanted to give you a sort of a brief overview of some of the things that were coming out of the programme that the charities we worked with really wanted funders to understand, and just very quickly let you know what we're planning to do with that. So some of these may seem extremely familiar to you. I think probably they are the kind of learning that most small charities could relate to. I maybe won't go through them all in great detail just for the sake of time, but I hope you'll find these interesting as some of the kind of key thoughts that were coming out of what the charities really wanted funders to understand. And they were particularly around funding time, funding thinking space, funding the ability to be proactive and look ahead, giving organisations some space to be able to really work out where their resilience challenges were and how they might need to address them. So we're looking to be able to encourage funders who want excellence from the charities that they work with, of course, but are maybe not thinking about funding it in quite the same way. One of the charities I worked with commented that everybody wants them to be excellent, but few want to fund them to be excellent, or rather fund the things that create and maintain excellence. So this is part of what the CAF Resilience Programme has been about, investigating what does it look like to really invest in an organisation for itself, so that we can use that as learning to be able to amplify. So moving on to the next slide, there were just 3 points on here around amplifying the learning. CAF are going to take this work that we've done, pull together a report that we will release, which will hopefully share the learning, both with charities like yourselves that might find that really interesting, but also with the sector, so with other organisations such as ourselves, who are infrastructure bodies that support to inform our own thinking, but particularly to use it as a way of encouraging more funders to be able to think about the way that they give, going beyond programme costs and even to an extent beyond core costs, to give funding, to give organisations some time and some thinking space so that they can address some of their challenges, particularly around those 6 areas of resilience. I'm going to pass over to Elizabeth from NCVO, who's going to go into a little bit more detail on the first of the characteristics. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. So I'm going to cover the characteristics of being financially and operationally fit and having awareness. Starting with the first, being financially and operationally fit. As Beth mentioned, this has potentially, this has got a huge scope. If you move on to the next slide, you can see that it ranges from ensuring your strategy identifies all the opportunities and risks that lie ahead, to ensuring the financial health of your charity and making best use of your resources. And of course, all this needs to be underpinned by having effective governance structures in place. I apologise, we do have a poll before I go into the detail. So if we go back to the previous slide, we are asking participants to give us an indication of any government funding they have benefited from. We've identified the key ones we are aware of in terms of what charities are, we've heard charities are making most use of. These are the job retention scheme, also known as the furloughing scheme, whether charities have applied to the funding that's being made available by the National Lottery Community Fund, or whether they've received funding directly from a particular government department. And particularly for charities that might have retail space or work in the leisure area, whether they've applied for the Retail, Hospitality and Leisure Grant Fund. This is to give us a sense of how well these schemes might be working for charities. As expected, the job retention scheme seems to be the one that most charities are making use of, and that sort of dovetails with what we've been hearing anecdotally. I will move on now, talking a little bit more about being financially and operationally fit. As I mentioned before the poll, this has huge scope, and charity trustees therefore need to identify the critical issues, the charity's purposes and plans, its solvency, its resilience, and the quality of the governance systems in place, and be able to review these at regular interviews. So it is a lot of work for trustees, particularly trustees of a small charity. So it's very helpful that the Charity Commission has actually set out 15 questions to help charity trustees carry out such a review and decide what they need to focus on. So if you move to the next slide, you can see quite user-friendly infographic that suggests some of the key questions for trustees. Although, of course, what will apply will depend on the size, type and activities of the charity, but these are definitely a good start for any charity. As Beth mentioned, one of the key issues within this area is the issue of financial resilience, and particularly now I think it's at the front of everybody's minds, as almost every charity has felt in some way the impact of the coronavirus. And I suspect every single charity is asking itself if it's financially strong enough to continue to provide services for its beneficiaries. And this is also due to the fact that the funding that is currently available is almost entirely focused on providing frontline response, meaning that there is a huge competition for grants and donations. At the same time, it's likely that people are going to be tightening their belts in face of an uncertain future. And fundraising, particularly in the sort of traditional way, such as street fundraising, for example, stopped overnight. But what we know from past experience is that when faced with these challenges, there's been a real surge in financial creativity amongst charities that have managed to diversify their income. Some examples that are worth exploring is broadening your sources of income by identifying other opportunities for funding, including developing a relationship with business, for example. Another option that has often been explored successfully is adopting a social enterprise model, so running a business that supports your charity, and that can be done by small charities as well. And there's some really interesting examples of small charities doing that successfully. And key is rethinking your fundraising strategy, for example, using free digital platforms to promote your charity online. The key issue is that if your charity has the tools to generate income from different sources, you'll be able to bounce back more easily and quickly if revenue from one source dries up. I'm now going to move on to the other characteristic of having awareness. It's really important to think about how the political, economic, social and technological environment in which you operate is going to change, and how this is reflected in your strategic planning, and thinking in particular whether any changes to the environment present any immediate challenges and opportunities for your charity. Every year, NCVO publishes what is known as the Road Ahead, where we do an analysis of all the key political, economic, social, technological drivers and what they might mean for charities. Understandably, this year's is it needs to be read bearing in mind that we didn't foresee a global pandemic. However, there are a number of questions that the Road Ahead sets out for trustees, which I think are still relevant and very helpful for trustees to think about, especially in light of what has happened over the last couple of months. So if you move, if we can move to the next slide, I've drawn out some of these questions for people to think about. I think it's still really important to think about how you get your voice heard and adapting your political approach to reflect the current environment. More important than ever is to think about how likely economic changes and possibly cuts to spending could affect both your organisation's work and the lives of your beneficiaries. Again, we've seen a very different way in which people engage and support causes over the last couple of months. So it's important now more than ever to reflect on your organisation's fundraising strategy. Next slide, please. And more broadly, things like ageing population and wider demographic changes aren't going to change. So it's really important to think about the impact these will have on your activities and services, but also on your own workforce and volunteers. And again, going back to the point of having seen how people engage differently, all of us now probably more than ever need to think about how we engage and support people who want to be active, but want to necessarily do it in a different way and on their own terms. Other huge issues that are going to come back on the agenda, such as climate change, are also things that charities need to think about. And lastly, I think, again, we've seen how technology over the last couple of months has played such a key role in enabling us to continue doing our work, including holding webinars like this one. So it's really important that charities think about how they can harness the power of technology to both engage with their supporters, but also with their users and communities. So these are just some of the sort of key questions that I've pulled out, but I think it's really important for every organisation, particularly after in the situation where we are now, to do that sort of forward scanning and replan, reassess, reprioritise, and be able to move forward. I'm now going to hand over to Alex, I believe, who's going to talk about impact. No? Yes. Purpose.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm going to talk about both of those things. So I'm going to talk about purpose and impact. And these are very two sides of the same coin, because all of our organisations were formed or founded in response to a need, and there was a clear driving purpose that we had when we established our groups, our associations and our organisations, very much often in response to a real need that we saw with our users or in the communities around us. And impact so deeply relates because we of course want to know that the work we're doing is making a difference to those that we are here to serve. So taking these in turn, purpose, as Beth said at the beginning, is the fundamental of an organisation or an association, and is about what we're here to achieve for our users or for our communities. And sometimes if we were setting up an organisation, here are some questions that we might want to ask ourselves. Now, many of you, and similarly us on this webinar, we're already in existence. And so one thing that we might be doing is using these questions to assess not so much what our purpose was, but whether our purpose is changing as a result, particularly of coronavirus, but also many of the trends that Elizabeth kind of talked through that will remain constant kind of as we go through coronavirus as well. But if we are trying to unpick our purpose, whether that's to start or whether that's to review and reflect on our purpose, there are some questions that we might want to ask ourselves. Crucially, I think we would want to know, who are we here for? For who are we in existence for? Who are we serving? This might be a particular community group, it might be a particular location, it could be kind of the causes of animals or climate change or the wider world. But we want to be really clear about who we're here to benefit, who is going to benefit as a result of the work that we do. We then want a really clear understanding of the problem and the issues underneath it, because we want our services and our projects or our activities to be explicitly connected to the changes that we see, that we want to achieve through our work. So we need a really clear understanding of the problem and then a clear understanding of what activities we will do to deliver on that, so that we can assess later on whether we're really having and making the difference that we want to see in the world. And some of those things can be brought together in a theory of change, something that would connect the needs with our activities and our aspirations in terms of changes. And theory of change can be a really useful tool, especially at this moment where there's so much volatility in our world. It might be quite hard to outline exactly what you're going to deliver, practically speaking, over the next months or the year, because we have there's so much that could change in the months ahead. It's hard to anticipate what the world might look like. But what we might be very clear on are the changes that we would want to see through this time that we think our organisation can contribute to achieving. So we might be able to focus on these higher level, the outcomes of our work, rather than the specifics about what we'll try and deliver and achieve because of the changing situation that we find ourselves in. Now, it's really easy as an organisation to establish perhaps a purpose and what we'll do, but it's really difficult to kind of articulate and to make decisions about what we might need to stop doing. And as Beth said at the beginning, organisations can start to drift as they grow and as they develop, and you might start to take on projects because of particular funding that's available, but at some point you might need to review and make decisions about what you can really achieve, what you can really afford perhaps during this time, and you might need to make some difficult decisions about deciding what to stop as well as what to start. Underneath this is always the values, and the values are about how we'll work and the things that will guide our decision making, not necessarily what we do, but how we do it. So there's some questions here to consider about your purpose as an organisation, both what it is, but also what it isn't and what it can't be, particularly in a time when our resources might be constrained, and yet the need for our services or our projects might be increasing. Something that can help us with that, and something that can help us to make really good decisions, is impact, one of the 6 characteristics that Beth explained at the beginning. And we also note at NCVO that people are increasingly very good at being able to articulate and communicate the difference that they're making, the impact that their work is having. There's a few things that we would want to just emphasize, I think. So Beth mentioned this at the beginning. Whilst accountability to our funders can be really important and expected from our funders, we should also be using evaluation and data for our own learning, particularly to inform decisions that we might be making in difficult times. So being really resourceful to use the data that we've got to inform and make sure our decisions are based on evidence. We want to build in some time probably to stop and reflect, and that can be really hard in a time of crisis. But actually, it's a really important part of us making good decisions about the future of our work. When we're looking at evaluation and at impact, we want to really know whether the things that we're delivering are making the difference that we want and expect. And if they are, great. Then we might want to focus more on how we're delivering things, what went well, what didn't go well, what should we do differently next time, to be continually improving the services and the projects that we run. But if we are finding from our evaluation that we're not achieving the things that we really set out to do, then we need to be asking ourselves what we need to be doing differently, perhaps in terms of the delivery, or it might be that the things we expected to change won't change as a result of our activities. Actually, we need to be doing something different. We might need to review our theory of change, as we said. And through all of this, be mindful of how your data collection methods might need to change. So evaluation and impact is built on good, reliable data. And that might be something that's harder to come by when we can't access our users and our beneficiaries in the same way. So purpose and impact, 2 things that we think are really important from those characteristics. I'm now going to pass over to Dan, who is our lead consultant with responsibility for governance, to talk about effective leadership.
Thanks very much, Alex. And my section really does follow on from what Alex has just described in terms of knowing our purpose and and understanding our impact. Can we have the next slide? So what I've tried to draw together here are some of the potential impacts of the coronavirus on leadership of small and micro charities. And I've also tried to think through what the potential responses for boards would be. My first of these is that there are definitely behavioural implications. People are affected by the coronavirus in lots of different ways, sometimes very personally. And all of that, you know, puts people under pressure. You know, people are having to work in different ways and are under, as I say, you know, different kind of strains. I think the crucial leadership response in regard to that is the need to kind of be respectful, to offer support, and to, as boards, exercise emotional intelligence in the way that we communicate with one another. I think it's also important to recognise that there will be changing kind of relationships over this period. If you've got any staff, or if you have senior volunteers who are, you know, very involved in running the organisation, I think it's helpful to kind of take stock of those relationships. Make sure that you do have dialogue with them, as if you're board members, or if you are those senior volunteers, you have dialogue with the rest of the board. Have an open discussion about kind of what people's roles are and what role you need them to play. And I think particularly for trustees who are in that leadership role in smaller organisations, it's really important to exercise that kind of flexibility to demonstrate that perhaps what was needed at the beginning of the pandemic isn't necessarily needed now. I think there are very few boards that we're speaking to who are not in some way concerned about sustainability, and we have redeveloped our financial kind of difficulty guidance on our know-how website, which, if you are in this position, I'd really encourage you to read. Obviously, in response to kind of concern for this, you need to exercise financial diligence. Make sure you understand your cash flow. What's coming in and what's going out over the next couple of weeks and months is really crucial, and no more so important than in smaller organisations. But one thing, and this really does link to what Alex said, that I think is important, is putting that beneficiary and cause first. I think sometimes we can look to preserve our organisations over necessarily those that we serve, and so we must always be testing our decisions around, actually, is this the right thing for those that we're here to serve? There is a short-term shift in the way that boards are operating, but I think as well we need to recognise that we need to make a change from dealing with crisis to some of that medium and longer term planning which Alex described. And I think, you know, that might involve stepping back as a board, perhaps carving out a bit of space and time to do some of the thinking which Alex has talked about. But this links to the next point, that requires you to kind of think about the pace of change, think about what change means, and maybe even assess your unknown unknowns. What do I mean by this? Well, essentially you need to think about your horizon. You need to think about the kind of strategic impact that this big change in the way that we all work, our beneficiaries access our services, has on our longer term plans. It's fair to say, I think there will be some paradigm shifts, things that will not go back to normal. I think with that comes an importance that, you know, and a need to be prepared to experiment and take some risks in the way that we do business, in the way that we work, and in the way that we deliver services. And then finally, my final kind of impact on leadership, I think, is one of, we have been operating in a period which has required really fast-paced decisions for many organisations. And, you know, such credit to trustees, many have rolled up their sleeves and jumped right in and kind of got much more kind of operationally focused. As I say, I think you need to make sure that you have dialogue with those that would normally be in that position to check those roles and responsibilities. But I would also say, in a time where you can be required to make very fast decisions, it's also really important not to forget about good governance and to make sure that you're still paying respect to kind of your risk management, to your reporting, of course, to keeping an eye on those finances. So don't ignore your kind of duty to still make decisions as a collective board. The other thing I would say in response to fast-paced decisions, which I didn't put on this slide, is to also take time out as a board. You know, a lot of people commit a great deal of time to their trusteeship, but if you burn out, then that's not going to serve your charity particularly well. Okay, and that's me done on leadership. So I'm going to hand back to Josie now.
Thanks, Dan. So we have had a few questions in. So I'm just going to work through some of those now. The first one I think is for Beth, really. Beth, could you explain why, like the reasons why CAF Resilience Programme was kind of focused on that 250k to $1 million income bracket?
Sure, no problem. Quite simply, we only had 10 spots. It was a fairly small scale programme. We were only going to work with 10 charities from across the UK. So in part, it was just simply to limit the number of applications that we had and to make sure that we weren't wasting a lot of charities' time. And reason for going from 250, to be honest, was because in general, and it does vary, but in general, it tends to be that charities below that size are less likely to have several full-time paid members of staff. And because of the intensity of the programme and how much we were looking for them to engage with us, spend time with our consultants, come to workshops, etc. At the time, in my personal life, I was a trustee of a charity that was close to 200k mark, who were doing some brilliant work, but I know that they, for example, wouldn't have been able to fully engage with the programme, and it would have been almost more overwhelming than helpful. So that was why we went with that. So doesn't particularly say anything about other charities of other sizes. It was just simply a practical decision.
Thanks, Beth. Elizabeth, perhaps a reflection for you. Do you feel that those 6 characteristics can be applied to charities of any size?
I think broadly, yes. It then depends on how much within each of those characteristics you want to sort of delve into what it actually means in practice. But in terms of broad areas to be looking at, I'm sure that both large, small, medium, all sizes of charities need to be thinking about their impact, whether they're sticking to their purpose, whether they're financially resilient, whether their strategy is effective. So I would say broadly, yes. It's then within each of those characteristics what it means in practice and the details of what that means and what it requires trustees to be thinking about that will change depending on size and type of charity and you know what sort of activities it carries out.
Thanks, that's great. Dan, we had 2 questions about recruiting trustees and the challenges that boards can sometimes face in recruiting trustees with the right skills. Any top tips for people about doing this?
Yeah, and I think what we'd probably do is circulate some guidance to this with our follow-up from the webinar. So we've got a page on our website. I think it's a particularly weird time to be recruiting trustees. I think being explicit about the way that you're kind of currently working is something which is probably helpful, and also might even widen your pool. You know, if there isn't an expectation to meet physically, then that might also diversify who can attend your board meetings. But we do have a lot of different places where you can advertise, and we also have a model advert. So we'll be sure to include the links for those things in the follow-up from this session, which will probably make better use of the time.
Great, thank you. One of the characteristics we haven't really touched on is about the organisations being well networked, and I just wondered whether, Dan, you might have any comments on this, and then maybe Elizabeth the same.
Can you just expand on that in terms of well networked slightly? Sorry, Josie.
Sorry. So one of the 6 characteristics of resilience that Beth mentioned was about organisations being well networked. So I think that's collaborating with other organisations.
Yeah, of course. Sorry. Forgive me. I thought that was forming as part of somebody's specific question into networks. I mean, I think there's lots of ways that trustees can do this. I think plugging into networks of other trustees is really useful. Particularly kind of at a local level, I think that can be very powerful. So I would encourage anybody to speak to their CVS to see if they have a network of local trustees. I think joining organisations like the Association of Chairs means that you're hearing voices from outside of your board and getting the latest updates and information. I also think that there's a huge value in kind of offering kind of peer support to other organisations, inviting somebody from another local organisation to see and witness your own board can be very powerful. So those are some of my tips on that.
Great. Elizabeth, any further reflections on the characteristic of well networked?
Again, I'd say that it feels more important than ever. Over the last couple of months, what we've seen is charities working in partnership in a way that possibly they weren't before. There's a huge appetite for more partnership working, and I think that, so I think it's a characteristic that again will sort of become even more important as we go forward, and the ability to rely on, as Dan said, to be able to have peer support and share experiences, I think will be particularly important going forward.
Great, thank you. And actually, just to mention on that, if you are an NCVO member, we are running a series of thinkins which are giving organisations the chance to discuss their experiences with other organisations. So do have a look out for those. Okay, a question for Alex really. So whether or not we have any, or whether you can recommend any tools for developing your strategy, particularly that are relevant for small charities. I think people are aware of the pest analysis, but is there anything else that people could have a look at?
Yep, sure. So the pest and the pestle analysis that Elizabeth talked through at the beginning is a great tool for things around the external environment. NCVO, we have produced a kind of booklet called Tools for Tomorrow, which is a collection of really useful tools that kind of kickstart discussions either with trustees or with staff or with volunteers to help you think through a whole range of different topics that might be the external environment. It might be about your resources and your financial breakdown. It could be around other people who are doing or delivering similar work in the local area. So I think that's my go-to in terms of a complete collection of tools that can really help you explore this in more detail. For members, there's also a downloadable business planning template, which is quite straightforward, but kind of takes you through the process of kind of prioritizing work areas to help you kind of implement that strategy as well. And I also mentioned theory of change as a tool for helping think about your purpose. And we've also got some good advice on our Know How Nonprofit website under our impact section, because theory of change can be a really useful thought process to help you really identify what changes you want to see and bring about in the world, and then what activities in this current context do you think can help achieve those. So I'm sure we'll be able to share some of those links out as well.
Great, thanks Alex. And yeah, we are going to share a variety of links in our kind of post-webinar email, so those should be signposted to you. A question, I think it was Elizabeth that mentioned that people's views on supporting the causes has kind of shifted in the last 2 months. And someone's asking about what evidence we have for this. Elizabeth, was it you? And can you comment on that?
Yes, I think it's actually a longer term trend that we've seen over a number of years, actually. But I think over the last couple of months, not necessarily the way in which people support causes, but the way in which people want to sort of activate themselves. So during the crisis, what we've seen is a lot of sort of spontaneous volunteering and groups popping up spontaneously as a sort of immediate response to what they've seen and wanting to help. And this has often happened outside the sort of traditional channels of an established charity and somebody going and saying that they want to volunteer. So I think, and that is something that if you add to the fact that as I say, as a longer term trend, we've noticed how the way in which people want to engage is changing. So, you know, for years we've been talking about this issue of micro volunteering and how the particularly perhaps younger generations want to dip in and out, not necessarily commit to volunteer on a regular basis with one particular charity, or sometimes they're not even attracted to a particular charity. They only care about supporting a certain cause, whether they do that through a charity or in other ways. It's a different approach to supporting the cause, and that's what I was referring to. There's a wider trend that it's worth charities being aware of.
Great, thank you. I think we've had a couple of comments about the challenges, Dan, of kind of managing the boundaries between operations and governance for trustees, particularly of very small organisations. Do you have any tips on this that you can share?
Yeah, it's a challenge for all organisations, and I think it's particularly acute right now, actually. There is a nature and a desire by many trustees, I think, to become to step in and to be useful. I think particularly in small charities where perhaps you don't have that many staff, or even if you don't have any, I think it's really useful to define the trustee role really clearly, to be absolutely sure on what the board's responsible for and then what others are responsible for. That's the first thing, and that's an exercise that you can go through in terms of actually trying to write those things down. And we have a great example delegated scheme of authority on our know-how site. The second thing I think is that trustees really need to understand the hats that they wear and be clear when they are being a trustee and when they are being a volunteer with the organisation, and just be mindful to kind of check themselves with that kind of the behaviour and the kind of approach which follows. That can be really difficult and it can take some time, but I think actually understanding a role is crucial there. And also, I suppose, finally, I think being willing to challenge as a board where you think those predetermined, pre-established boundaries that you've set up have perhaps lapsed. Even if it's by one person, you can challenge in a constructive way and say, actually, feels like you're being more of a volunteer there than you are being a trustee. Just be mindful of that. That culture is important.
Great, thank you. We've only got one more minute sort of left for questions. I'm going to ask a final one to Elizabeth, which I think is a kind of common problem, which is about how in the current kind of climate, there's so much information out there about the various government funding schemes, and it can feel quite overwhelming. And where would you suggest is a good place to go to get advice on this, or suggestions of which schemes are particularly appropriate for your organisation?
I think that's a really good point, and it's the overwhelming amount of information isn't helped by the fact that there are other sort of ways in which funding has been distributed that is not always very clear. I think the first place is if you're looking to make use of any of the financial support that's been made available by government, you go to the government website, which sets out all the different schemes from coronavirus business interruption loans to the job retention scheme, and it'll then signpost to guidance on how to apply, eligibility and things like that. Second to that is if you do want to apply for funding, particularly from the National Lottery Community Fund, I would advise to go to their website, where they set out very clear eligibility criteria. And then it's also being aware of the National Emergency Trust and the funding that is distributing in partnership with community foundations. So they're the sort of three key places I would advise charities to go to.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm aware we only have 4 minutes left. We did have 1 or 2 questions about how organisations can kind of effectively engage and involve volunteers during this time. Just to say, we have just released a blog about this from our volunteering development team. So we will be sharing that in the follow-up email to help you answer that question. The other kind of question that we are going to be addressing directly is people asked about changes in redundancy processes and what that process might look like. We are looking at doing a webinar around redundancies in the not too distant future, so do keep an eye out for that. So just before we finish up, I just want to, on the next slide, just highlight a few of our kind of practical support bits. I'm sure if some of you have been on our webinars before, you're aware of these, but I'd just like to reiterate them. So we've mentioned a lot of our guidance, which is on our NCVO know-how site. And of course, as it's Small Charity Week, I would suggest you have a look at the Small Charity Week website and see what else is going on as part of this week's activities. As mentioned, we do have a lot of webinars coming up. So yeah, do keep an eye on that. Our next webinar is going to be on the 24th of June at 11 AM, and we're looking at the easing of lockdown and what are some of the kind of legal and practical considerations organisations need to be aware of in the kind of returning to work phase. As I've mentioned before, we are recording this webinar, and of course we would love to hear your feedback. I think we also, at the end of this, if we move on to the next slide, we've also highlighted, which you probably will have already seen when we sent round the slides, just some kind of key help and guidance which has been mentioned already. So just highlighting some of the Charity Commission guidance that was particularly mentioned in Elizabeth's presentation, and then also our own NCVO guidance on various things, such as the pest analysis, diversifying your income and scenario planning. All of that guidance at the moment is open to everyone, so please do, including our tools, so please do have a look at those. Moving on to the next slide, just wanted to highlight that in terms of CAF's resilience programme, there is more information about this and what funders can do to provide more support in terms of resilience for small charities. So do have a look at that report, and also CAF has a lot of materials that will be useful for organisations. It's 1 minute before 3, so I think we're going to call it a close for today, but many thanks once again for joining us, and we do hope to see you at our next webinar. Many thanks.